Welcome to this introduction to a great airplane. In this program, we'll bring you a short history of the Cessna 195 series, differences between models, visits with owners, tours of restoration and engine shops, and things you should be aware of if you're in the market for a Cessna 195. But first, let me emphasize this is not a checkout tape. No video, book, or film can substitute for competent flight instruction. Nor in this brief program can we tell you everything about the airplane. Our purpose is to give you a quick summary of the good points and the weaknesses of the airplane and include some interviews with very knowledgeable people. And we'll close with an introductory flight. We were inspired to produce this video by the many inquiries and questions we get at Oshkosh and other fly-ins around the country. People always coming up to us and saying, "I want a 195. What can you tell me about this airplane?" If you're one of those people, I hope we'll answer most of those questions with this program. This old airplane has been a part of our lives for almost 4 decades. And needless to say, I've got quite a bit of time in it. But that doesn't make me the world's foremost 195 expert. No way. Much of what you hear today will be strictly my opinion, and take it for what it's worth. I'm sure that some may disagree with a point here and there, and that's okay. But if you can take all of this stuff and put it together and make an informed decision, and we've helped you significantly in that process, then we will have accomplished our purpose. In December of 1944, the prototype of what was to become the Cessna 195 made its first flight. Known as the P-80, it used as many of the T-50, the bamboo bomber or spruce goose parts, as possible. It was powered by the 245 Jacobs engine. It had a T-50 cowl and sat on the brand new Steve Whitman designed spring steel landing gear. The cantilever wing was all metal, but the fuselage was welded steel tube and fabric covered. It closely resembled the great Cessna Airmaster of the 1930s. Well, it was designated the Model 190 in 1945 after being extensively redesigned and now included in all metal fuselage and the distinctive bubble cowl you see here. A second ship was flown in 45 with the 300 horsepower Jacobs. And the third airplane was built that year and flown with the 240 Continental. Both airplanes had good performance, so the company decided to produce 2 versions, the 190 with the Continental and the 195 with the 300 Jacobs. The 195 received its type certificate in June 12th of 1947, and the 190 came along about 3 weeks later. In 1950, Cessna brought out the 195A with the 245 Jacobs. And in 1952, the 195B came along with the 275 Jacobs. The last airplane rolled off the line in 1954. A total of 1,182 airplanes were built, 1,183 if you want to count the prototype, and included 233 190s, 866 195s, and 83 of the military LC-126s. The Cessna 195 was approved for wheels, floats, and skis. And let me tell you, if you're seriously interested in a Cessna 195 on floats, probably the most knowledgeable person in the operation of float-equipped 195s is Roger Currier of the Currier Flying Service in Greenville Junction, Maine. He operates 2 or 3 float-equipped 195s and would be happy to talk to you about them. His number's right here on the bottom of the screen. He told me that a Cessna 195 on floats performs about like a Cessna 180 without flaps. Over the last 30 years or so, there have been some modifications come along that we should talk about. In the late 1960s, Page Aeromotive in Oklahoma City, who at that time owned the Jacobs type certificate, took the basic 245, installed a Garrett Air Research turbo, boosted the horsepower to 350. There are not too many of those around. But we'll talk more about that mod when we get to the engine segment and talk with Steve Curry. One of the most valuable mods is the Cleveland brake conversion. Now, the original Goodyears were adequate, barely. But now parts are getting rather hard to come by. The more modern Cleveland brakes are much more powerful. And if you're not careful, you can either put the airplane on its nose or damage the gearbox, because really it's more brake than the airplane was designed for, but they're great. I highly recommend the Cleveland brakes. Several years ago, Ray's Aircraft Service in Porterville, California, came out with a locking tail wheel. I've not had any experience with it, but I've been told that it helps a lot on rollout after landing, and boy, that is important. Okay, now let's go talk about some of the more significant differences between models. That is, if my 72-year-old knees will let me get up. Throughout the 7-year production run of the Cessna 195, the company made many evolutionary changes. But the first big change came along with the 195B in 1952. At that time, the light gear was introduced along with the crosswind gear. Now, the light gear was obviously lighter and thinner than the heavy gear. It was also much springier, and I believe that made it a little bit more forgiving. The crosswind gear was Cessna's attempt to make the airplane more forgiving on the ground. Remember, the 195 was competing with the Bonanza and the Navion, which were both tricycle-geared airplanes and much easier to handle on the ground. This was becoming an important issue as more businessmen were learning to fly, and they didn't want to fool with developing the skill required to handle a heavy tail dragger. If a pilot touched down in a slight crab, the crosswind wheels would jump out of the detent, swivel about 30 degrees, and allow the airplane to proceed down the runway kind of sideways. It looked silly, but undoubtedly it saved some airplanes. By the way, if an airplane is equipped with wheel pans, it does not have the crosswind gear. The next big change that occurred happened at serial number 16083, which was late in the 1953 model year. The model in production at that time, remember, was the Model 195B. First thing they did was change the length of the flap. This is a small flap. In 1954 model, after 16083, the flap was extended this far. Now, the flaps are electrically operated. They're either all down or all up is a normal position. There's no need to stop them intermediately, though you can do that. Remember, though, they're all drag. There's no lift whatsoever in those flaps, and they're never used for takeoff. The pitot was also relocated from its original position on the leading edge to a new position just after the leading edge on the bottom. And the static ports were removed from the original location in the pitot tube and relocated to a point right here on both sides of the airplane. Also, the elevator shape was changed, and the trim tab was redesigned. All models of the 195 and the 190 had a retractable landing light. One light on the left was standard, but two lights were optional, the one on the left and the one on the right. It takes 15 seconds for those lights to come down and illuminate, and they draw an awful lot of power. A neat feature on the 195 also is a retractable step. Well, there you are. But this by no means covers everything about the history of the 195 and model differences. But I think we've hit the high points. As our title suggests, we've covered what you need to know to get you off to a good start in your search for a Cessna 195. Now, for a fabulous history about the development of the 195, I suggest a book by a former Cessna flight test engineer, Bill Thompson. Bill was deeply involved with the 195 in the development phase. His book is titled Cessna Wings for the World, the Cessna Single Engine Development Story. It's available from the author, and I'll list his address at the end of the tape. Also, there are two type clubs, and you should belong to both of them. Now, don't ask me why there are two type clubs. Kind of like a church split, I guess. Anyway, there's a lot of fellowship to be had and a lot of good information. Their addresses are also listed at the end of the tape. All right, now, it's time to hit the road, look at some pretty airplanes, and talk to some very knowledgeable people. We'll begin with a trip to Riverside, California, and the home of one of the most beautiful 195s I've ever seen. My friend Ron Karwacki took a rundown derelict and turned it into a thing of beauty. Ron and his fabulous 195 are well known in classic airplane circles. This year at Oshkosh, his airplane will be prominently displayed at the Vintage Airplane Division headquarters. Like his airplane, his hangar is spotless. We're here in Riverside, California, at Ron Karwacki's hangar, one of the most beautiful hangars I've ever seen, but the important thing about this hangar, it's got one of the most beautiful 195s you'll ever see. This airplane has been on the cover of several magazines, right, Ron?
Yeah.
I remember a private pilot not too long ago.
Last year we were lucky. We got on the EAA magazine from Sun and Fun, and private pilot in September.
How does it feel to be the owner of such a famous 195?
It's hell.
It's hell?
It's hell.
What do you mean? What do you? It can't be.
But I eat it all up.
I'll bet you do. Yeah, I'll tell you, it is a gorgeous airplane. How long have you owned it, Ron?
We've had it 15 years now, going on 16 years this May. We bought it, we were putting together a Stearman, Larry. And we had to have something to fly. I didn't have my license at the time. My airplane partner at the time, he had his license, so we said we went to an air show and we decided we wanted to get a Stearman. So the Stearman wound up being 9 years getting it in the air, but we had to have something we had to fly, and we came across this one up in Apple Valley, up in the high desert, that had been sitting out for quite a while, and of course it didn't look like this.
I was going to say, it obviously was not in this condition.
No, it looked like an old piece of galvanized pipe when we got it.
Yeah. And I understand you have an interesting story about getting checked out in this airplane.
Well, we were in our hangar one day. We had the 195 there. It had been ferried into us, and I had been polishing away on it, you know, trying to clean it up, and this old fellow walked in the hangar one day, and he says, I understand there's two guys here have an airplane, they don't know how to fly. Well, old Ted Warner became one of our best friends after that day, and 9.5 hours later, I soloed in this airplane.
And that was how long ago?
That's 15 years ago.
You know, that is amazing, Ron. You know, most people say you got to have a bunch of tail dragger time and so forth, and I know of two people that have soloed in the airplane, and you're one of them. And it shows it can be done. Now, as a flight instructor, I'm not sure I'd want to take it on, but you had an awfully good flight instructor, and obviously you pretty good native ability.
Well, everybody tells me that being a model airplaner, that had a lot to do, because I knew just what every control surface did and how it should react and what have you, so maybe that helped. Maybe.
Well, you know, as an RC flyer myself, I know that it works that way. An RC flyer has an idea how things work. Now, it doesn't work the other way. You know, a full-size pilot going back to RC, it doesn't work.
That's very true, and I can give you several stories about that.
Oh, I bet you can.
Clubs.
I bet you can. Ron, what advice would you give to someone who's looking for a 195 today? What to look for, that sort of thing?
Well, it's a big airplane. I wouldn't let anything stop me from doing it again. Although I would be looking, you know, as far as mechanical, you want to get a good checkout, a good mechanic to look it all over. Because
pre-purchase inspection.
Yeah, but as far as learning how to fly in it, it's a pussycat, but it's just like any other tail dragger. If you get a little bit behind you, it might bite you.
Yeah, okay, but you wouldn't necessarily discourage somebody from buying a 195 just because he didn't have tail dragger time with
Definitely not. I have talked to so many people, and over the years, I've 4 people right in the Southern California area have 195s now, I believe, because I talked them into it.
You know, I think it's important to emphasize at this point a first-class flight instructor. Okay. A man that really knows the airplane. That's key. Not necessarily...
Man that knows the airplane.
That knows the airplane. Yeah, that's an interesting story, Ron, and I'm glad to hear you talk about it. Well, I'll tell you.
Larry, excuse me, it's the best of all worlds, this airplane. It's big, it's fast, it's comfortable, and it attracts a hell of a lot of attention no matter where it goes.
Amen. I couldn't have said that any better myself. I couldn't have said it any better myself. Well, Ron, I really want to thank you for letting us share with you your hangar and your airplane.
Well, thank you very much for coming down. It was good seeing you again.
How about that? Bought a 195 and didn't even know how to fly. Learned to fly in it and soloed in it. That's not impossible. I know 2 or 3 other people who have done that. But it takes a very competent instructor and, of course, a lot of native ability on the part of the pilot. Ron, we must remember, had a considerable amount of experience as a contest radio control pilot. And that does give him some idea of the aerodynamics involved and so forth. I've seen a lot of beautiful 195s around the country, but let me tell you, Ron's is in the top 3 in my opinion. My airplane doesn't look too bad, but it sure doesn't compare with his. Of course, Ginnie and I run ours hard and put it away wet sometimes. It's a working airplane after all. Most of the 195s in the country really look a lot better than they did when they left Wichita. Now, let's go take a look at another 195 in the Los Angeles area, an LC-126, a military version. It's owned by Dennis Dugan down in Corona, California. Let's go visit him. In 1949, the Air Force bought 15 LC-126A aircraft, which were delivered with floats and skis. The only structural difference with civilian models was the left side escape hatch. 5 more were purchased for the National Guard in 1951 and were designated the LC-126B. Differing only in radio gear, they were identical to the LC-126A. Finally, in 1952, the Army bought 63 LC-126Cs, which differed from the previous models in that they had a large baggage door for stretcher patients. Folks, I'm here with Dennis Dugan from Corona, California. We're in the beautiful airport at Corona. Dennis flies a 767 normally for American Airlines, got in from Honolulu last night, and I woke him up this morning and drug him down here to show us his beautiful LC-126. Dennis, this is a gorgeous airplane. Tell me about it.
The LC series was originally built for the Army Air Corps. This was one of the last ones built, the C model. It was most distinguished by the big baggage door. They used them for medevac. They could put 2 litters in the back behind the pilots and evacuate out of remote areas. They, as I understood it, were originally supposed to go up to the Pine Tree and do lines, some of our defenses, radar remote sites.
The Army also used the LC-126, and they use them for instrument trainers, mostly out of Fort Rucker and Fort Sill. I'm not really sure how many they had, but they were a total of, 100 LC series built, I think. A total of 100 of them.
I couldn't tell you on that.
Okay, well, Dennis, I sure thank you a lot for showing us this beautiful airplane.
You're welcome.
Boy, I'll tell you, there are a lot of beautiful 195s in the country, but those two are just the tip of the iceberg. I wish Ginnie and I had the time and the money to go film them all, but that, of course, is out of the question. But it is time now to go visit one of the finest 195 maintenance and restoration shops in the country. John and Marilyn Collette, Butterfly Aviation in Goodland, Kansas. Let's go. Near the geographical center of the country in the small town of Goodland, Kansas, is located one of the best little FBO operations you're likely to find. What makes this place special is that you'll always find several 195s in various stages of restoration or receiving routine maintenance. John Collette has earned a well-deserved reputation as one of the foremost 195 experts in the country. Well, I'm in John's shop, John Collette's shop. We're standing by a Cessna 195 that's being restored, repaired from a ground loop, I presume, right? And it's in the fuselage jig, and the fuselage jig is very important. John, it's sure good to be here with you. You and Ray Woodmansey, I guess, are about the best-known 195 restorers, 195 shops in the business. How do you like working on 195?
Oh, I really enjoy it.
Yeah, you'd like to make a full-time job of it, wouldn't
Right.
you? You have to work on those thrushes and crop dusters back there as your day job, is that right?
Well, more or less, yes. Well, I work on these probably more than I do them personally, but
yeah. And how many do you have in the shop right now undergoing restoration?
Yeah, we've had 3 right now. One is flying at this time, just ready to go home.
Okay, tell me, what is important for a new owner or a prospective owner to look for when he wants a 195?
Well, just overall condition. When we do a pre-buy check on one, we get asked to do that occasionally. We usually run a compression check and just look for oil leaks and any sorts of trouble up there. If we go back into the fuselage, we look for specifically a crack in a doorpost. That seems to be an ailment that they develop over years.
Now, that's about the most important thing, isn't it, to look for?
That's one of the most obvious or critical things, and it takes quite a bit of time and effort to fix. A wing has to be removed and the doorpost pulled out. To show kind of where that goes, the doorpost, this is the one we have out, but it goes right up through here.
Okay.
And the crack develops right up here in this bend area.
Okay.
And cracks back around that member. And if it gets very far, it's got to be replaced. We do have a reinforcement we use.
Now that thing comes all the way down here, doesn't it?
It comes clear to the gearbox.
Okay, so it's not a pre-flight item or a 100-hour item to replace it, is it?
No. To see it, you have to take out some upholstery piece up there, which is just a couple screws in the air vent slide piece. And you can see right in there where it's at. But people miss it. look
Well,
right
I
at it
think-
and don't see it. So
I think it's very, very important for somebody to know have somebody that he knows what he's looking for to inspect that. But that's something that a prospective owner should really have checked out very closely, right?
yes.
Now, I understand you have a fix for that if it's not too bad.
Well, if it's not cracked but just barely getting started, we have a stainless steel reinforcement that's been a heat-treated piece of stainless that goes underneath the skin, and you don't even see it once it's installed. And I even recommend that goes in if you put in a new doorpost,
Okay,
that you put it in before it cracks.
okay.
And then it should. We've never seen one crack that's had one installed, and the ones we have put in with a crack, we have not seen the crack progress.
Now, you have to pull the wing to put that plate in?
Yes.
Okay, so it's still quite a job.
Yeah, I'm going to take the wing off just so you get to the rivets. If there's a way to shoot those rivets, you might get it in there.
All right, now what else, from an airframe standpoint, is particularly critical to determine the condition of?
Well, some things that, not just on a pre-buy necessarily, but even on your 100-hour annuals, the brake linings, hoses under the floor from your master cylinders down to the solid aluminum lines, some of these have not been changed since '47. And they need to be changed at some point. And we've found some really in bad shape. I don't know if I've heard of any bursting or not, but they're not terribly hard to change. They're not fun, but they're not terribly hard. Another thing to watch is in the master cylinders, we just, every 4 or 5 years or so many 100 hours, 300 or 400 hours, we change the O-rings out of those master cylinders because they wear, and you don't want to lose a brake when you need it. and when sometimes those O-rings roll over, it goes to the floor. And you don't have time to pump it back up, and it may not pump back up. So we like to change those just as preventative maintenance. Another item on back, we kind of like to watch the rudder trim bell crank. The first couple of years they made the 195, that wasn't in there. But the later ones it is, and the springs that hook to it can wear the holes out. And those need to be watched and reboosted if they get worn, and so that they don't tear out. And then another thing in the back of the tail we didn't talk about, we need to probably mention, is the steering cables that come off the walking beam back there to your tail wheel. We've had people come in and say, this thing, I don't have any steering. It just feels like it wants to go anywhere it wants to go. Well, the cables were not crossed. And so it was steering backwards, if they got any steering at all. And we found the tail wheel steering arms on backwards on occasion, or a cable of the spring broken back there, and so that's a very important area to watch, and on the steering of the tail wheel.
I think it's, to emphasize that, John, it's important to make sure that the 195 is maintained by people that have experience with the 195. Because you're absolutely right, somebody takes a look at those tail wheel cables and they're crossed, and they say, oh, it shouldn't be that way, we'll make them straight, and then of course it steers the wrong way.
Right.
Little idiosyncrasies like that. What else do you think we ought to talk about?
Well, there's ADs we kind of look at when we're doing a pre-buy, or of course on an annual, either one. There's not very many. There's a rudder cable AD, and there's some pulleys under the floor, right under the control column. And in the couple first years they made them, they put a smaller pulley down there.
Now that just applies to the early one.
Just to the early ones. And I didn't look up the serial number, but it's not too terrible many of them. And the fix is, of course, to change the bracket and the pulley, and that is not an easy task. That's best done when the belly skin's off. When we rebuild one, we watch for that and get the big pulleys in there. Another one is the elevator hinge area on about the same basic serial numbers. They had some cracking problems around the outboard aileron hinge. And that's another thing to watch for. That's an AD. But again, that's on the early ones, and if they've been reinforced, that's taken care of. Another area that's not an AD is the weight on the end of the elevator. The spar just has a little tab that bends forward to hold that rib, and those will crack on occasion. And if that happens, that needs to be gotten into and reinforced.
Okay, can you see that crack?
Yes, yeah, you can just see it by just looking in there. And then we were talking about, I guess the wing spar is another area, and that was an AD back in the early 60s, and it had to be x-rayed and a steel bar put on the front and back because they had a failure. And I think I understand in all the x-rays they only found one more cracked.
Well, I think that was a one-time AD.
That was a one-time, but it recurs every year just for a visual to look at that center section in there.
Right after I bought my 195 in 1963, I got hit with that AD.
Well, I was the new A&P when that come out. I was working with a fellow that had two 195s, and he had to have both of them done.
Yeah.
And I didn't do it personally, but they went down to Yingling and Wichita to be done.
Okay, what's the future for this particular airplane?
Well, it'll be going back home whenever it's finished.
Where's home?
Down by Houston.
Okay.
And this one, in the ground loop, they don't know for sure, I guess, which happened first, a little bit of a ground loop, and then it broke a gear leg, or the gear leg broke. But we are having a little experiencing some gear leg breakage, usually with the heavy gear, or more so than the light gear. Mm-hmm. And this one did have light gear. And it was almost, it kind of looked like this gear might have had a hairline crack starting underneath it. And it breaks right where it comes out of the gear, out of the gearbox in the wedges under there. And that's another area to watch for on an inspection, is to make sure those wedges are tight.
Now, if a 195 is a relatively high-time airplane, you're going to buy it or have it first annual, do you think it's a good idea to pull the gear legs and have Magnaflux?
That's getting to be a pretty much a recommended procedure. Ray in California is kind of recommending that every time you overhaul the engine, every say 1,200 hours or so, that you do the engine, that while you got the engine off, just pull the gear legs and let's Magnaflux and shot peen.
That's probably not a bad idea.
Yeah, and that shot peening gives them, that's the way they were manufactured originally. After the heat treat, they were shot peened to give that surface hardness.
All right. Anything else you think we ought to talk about with the new owner or the prospective owner in mind, if he's looking for an airplane?
Now, I guess another area we were visiting about earlier was the toilet seat bulkhead.
Oh, yeah, the bulkhead.
And that's the aft bulkhead in the tail cone, and the tail wheel attaches. And if the tail wheel is not kept serviced properly and starts bottoming out and banging, you can crack the lower part of that bulkhead where the wheel attaches, where that strut attaches.
Okay, well, John, I really appreciate you taking the time from your busy schedule working on these 195s to talk to me. And I know that over the years that I've known you, you've done a lot of good work on my airplane, and I really appreciate it.
Hopefully we've had some help.
This upper door post problem is becoming more prevalent as the fleet ages. And I think it's vitally important that if you're looking at a 195, one of the first things you do is have a knowledgeable mechanic who knows what he's looking for take a close look at this area up here. All right, now I'm going to give you my opinion, and that's strictly what it is. Take it for what it's worth. I don't believe that the upper door post problem is necessarily related to time on the airframe or age on the airframe. This airplane has 6,400 hours on it, and the door posts are fine, knock on wood. I think the ones that have the problem with the door posts are those that have been abused, have a history of damage, particularly ground loops. Another factor to consider, I think, is a heavy gear. Heavy gear is stiffer, imparts more shock to the airframe, and over the years that could be a problem. But another thing that I rarely hear anybody talk about, but that is tying the airplane down outside with chains instead of ropes. Chains have no slack. They a lot of shock to the wing when the airplane rocks in the wind, and when that chain hits the end, that shock travels all the way down the spar and into this upper door post area. Something to consider. Now, let's run on down to Florida and visit some dear old friends who have a gorgeous airplane on their own private airstrip. Located about 10 miles northeast of Ocala, Florida, in beautiful horse country, the private Idlewild Airport is the home of John and Sarah Hambleton. Although retired, John maintains a small shop, and the welcome mat is always out for fellow 195ers.
Well, Sarah, you and John have had your Cessna 195 since 1965, and Larry and I have had ours since 1963. They're part of the family, and we've been so many places in it. It's such a wonderful airplane to travel in. Where have you been in yours?
Let's see, Ginnie. John and John Jr. flew to Baja, California when John was about 10. We've made a very nice trip to Alaska. We had a nice trip with the 3 children to the Bahamas. And, of course, many, many trips to Canada. And many places in the United States.
Right. We've been to Alaska too in ours. We've been as far north as Fairbanks, and we've been to Mazatlan in Mexico, and like you say, all over the U.S. Like you, we belong to the Cessna International 195 Club, and with their annual meetings, we've been to Ottawa, we've been to Toronto, we've been to Oklahoma City, back to Wichita, take the baby birds home, and all over the U.S., New Orleans. I just can't think of all the different places we've been. And through that club, we've met so many wonderful people like you and John and so many other friends that we only see once a year, but it's just like family.
Exactly. We consider them our second family.
Absolutely.
Right.
And traveling as much as we do, one big advantage of the Cessna 195 is the huge baggage compartment. We can put everything in it we need, right?
Exactly. 3 weeks worth of stuff easily.
And you said you have an ox?
We have an ox baggage in ours, and you can put extra things back there. Yeah. Tennis rackets, golf clubs, fishing poles, dirty laundry.
That's always a problem. What else? Let's see. When we go to Oshkosh, my gosh, what we put in it then. Tents, sleeping bags, everything you need, chairs, tables, and I even carry a porta potty. So anything you want to put in that plane, I think you probably can. So you have a beautiful home here in Ocala, and thanks for inviting us down to visit with you and shoot the video.
You're welcome to Idlewild anytime.
Oh, thanks.
Come again.
Thanks, Sarah.
Wow, two great ladies. I don't know what John and I'd do without them. I also talked to John while we were down there. But before I get to that, let me tell you a little bit about John Hamilton. John retired from the Air Force in the 1970s after a long, distinguished career as a fighter pilot and a test pilot. His father was a World War I fighter pilot and also was one of the 3 original founders of Pan American World Airways. After retiring from the Air Force, John and Sarah set up an FBO in Fort Walton Beach, Florida, where for many years they sold lake amphibians and really ran a very successful operation. Retiring again in the 80s, they moved to Idlewild. John is an A&P, an AI, and one of the most knowledgeable 195 people there is. He's a real asset to those who live in Florida. And on top of that, he's a real nice guy. John, you live every pilot's dream. Here you've got a gorgeous home on your own grass airstrip in a beautiful part of Central Florida. I don't know. I just envy you.
And not only that, Larry, I've got my own Cessna 195.
At least I got one of those.
Yes,
and they're both sitting out here on your grass strip. As we talk, we're looking at them. John, I know that you're a very experienced AI. You're very well known in the 195 circles and in the Southeast. And if anybody wanted to bring an airplane to you for a pre-purchase inspection, the key is they'd have to bring it to you, right?
Yes, Larry, I do occasionally do things if people will bring them to me. I'm supposed to be retired. And as I pointed out before, the name of the airport here reflects that. Since I retired, I'm idle, my wife is wild, so that's where the name came from.
Sarah's wild? Yes, I didn't know Sarah was wild. She hides it well.
Right.
What would you advise, what advice could you give to a prospective 195 owner about what to look for in the airplane?
Well, Larry, of course, the advice is the same as for any airplane you're going to buy, is a good inspection and a good check of the paperwork trail, records in Oklahoma City. But peculiar to the 195, I can think of a few things. Corrosion is an important thing to look for, particularly up in the wings. The wing spar caps are prone to corrosion. They're made of some material that's prone to corrosion, and when they do, they swell up and start popping rivets. And it's easy to see.
You can
from
see
outside.
that from outside here?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Sure. And there's a Cessna service bulletin concerning cracks in the doorpost bulkheads.
Okay.
Cracked doorposts. And that's what holds the airplane together. The doorposts hold the wing to the fuselage and the landing gear and everything. So it's a major operation. The repair for a crack is to replace the bulkheads.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to have that service bulletin signed off.
And by somebody that knows what he's looking for.
Absolutely. Because I've missed one.
Yeah.
Aileron hinge brackets. That's very hard to see. They are it is possible to have cracks in the aileron hinge brackets that are very hard to see, so it's important to have a real good look there because it's almost impossible to find a replacement for them.
Mm-hmm. But you know, it's amazing, there are very few ADs on the airplane, right?
That's correct. There's just a few ADs on the airframe, and none of them very important, and no ADs on the engine or the propeller.
That's really incredible. You know, Mort Brown, who for many, many years was the chief of production flight tests at Cessna, flew every model, tested every model, and I just read where he says that the Cessna 195 is the best airplane Cessna ever built.
Yes, I know. He said that's his favorite airplane.
And what do you feel about it?
The same way.
I do,
It's a
too.
wonderful airplane. It's big, and it's rugged, and it's reliable, and it's fast enough. I've said many times that 3 people wide, I've had 3 fat gals on the back seat.
Does Sarah know that?
Yes, Sarah knows all about that. She was there, not in the back seat.
Okay, she wasn't one of the fat gals, no.
And I have a Honda 90 motorcycle that goes in the baggage compartment, comes apart. So it's plenty big and plenty rugged.
Well, you know, you and I have both had our airplanes for over 30 years, well over 30 years. And I got to know you through the 195 Club many years ago. And I've met some of our best friends today are people we've met through the 195 Club, and we certainly include you and Sarah on that list. And it's a pleasure to be here, and I thank you so much for inviting us.
Well, Larry, we're delighted to have you and want you to come back anytime.
Oh, that's great. I might take you up on that.
All right, great.
On the way home to Colorado from John and Sarah's, we stopped by Guthrie, Oklahoma, to visit the only engine shop currently specializing in the overhaul of Jacobs engines. Radial Engines Limited is located on a farm north of Oklahoma City and is about the only game in town if you're looking for an overhauled Jacobs engine. Steve Curry owns and operates this place, and in addition to being very knowledgeable, he's also one of the nicest people you meet in the business. I got him talking about our beloved Shaky Jake, so let's listen. Okay, we're here to talk about the Jacobs engine, which the 195 is equipped with. Yes. And also, we want to talk about the Continental engine that's equipping the 190. Mm-hmm. What can you tell us about the Jacob engine? The difference in models, which is the best, and problem areas, and that sort of thing.
Okay. The original Jacobs engine was the R755-9 245 horse engine. Those were produced by the tens of thousands during World War II, and so it was a natural, at the end of World War II, when the Cessna 195 was produced, it was a natural to go on that aircraft. Simultaneously, Jacobs came out with the 300 horsepower engine, which utilizes many of the same parts as the 245, but has a higher compression piston and also breathes a little better. From the end of the war until 1952, these were basically your 2 factory engine choices for the 195. In 1952, Jacobs found themselves with literally thousands of the 245 horse engines, which weren't selling that well. So they took the piston cylinder combination from the 300 horse, put it on their 245, and the 275 horse engine was born.
How about that?
And the 275 proved to be really their best engine, reliability-wise. It's just a great engine. Also, the other Jacobs engine that you might find on the Cessna 195 is the 330 horse L6 engine, which was produced during the war for the Avro Anson in Canada. That was not an original engine on the 195, but is STC'd for the 195, and there are several flying. So those are basically the Jacobs engines that you'll see commonly on the 195.
I have always heard that the 300 had a problem with case cracking.
Yes, it did. Probably when you overhaul these engines, you'll lose about 1 case in 4. Mm-hmm. I've never seen one fail catastrophically. It's just that upon overhaul, you inspect the case for cracks and find that about 1 in 4 is cracked.
Yeah, and that's the 300, right?
On the 300.
Okay.
The 275s and the 245s almost never crack.
All right. Now, I understand with the 330, which makes quite a performance boost to the 195. Mm-hmm. problem has always been with shortage of parts, pistons and rods particularly.
It has been. It was a much lower production engine than the 245, 275, 300. But one of the big problems, the Achilles heel for the 330, has always been the piston. Was not a good design with the piston. We are in the process right now of correcting that problem. We have a piston that has a much better design, much better ring configuration, and we have those pistons manufactured right now, and we're working with the FAA for approval on them. I really think that this will revitalize the L6 and make it an engine that will be very desirable for the 195.
That's great. That's great. Now, some people are looking at 190s. There's still a few of them around with a Continental engine. What can you tell us about that?
It's a good engine. Not a bad engine at all. Shares many parts with the 220 Continental, and the parts that it shares with the 220 Continental are in great supply, no problem at all. However, the 240 horse itself was a very low production engine, numbers-wise, and so the parts that are very specific to the 240 horse are rare. Main bearings, oil transfer rings, pistons, those are very, very difficult parts to find. And so, as a result, many people that are buying 190s with a good running engine on them fly the engine until it's run out, and then convert to a Jacobs just because of the part situation with the 240 Continental.
Of course, we should mention if they do that, they have to get a new mount, new cowl.
They do.
Firewall forward.
Yeah.
Sometimes that could be a problem.
It's a big deal.
It's a big deal. All right. Now, the other differences with the Jacobs are the battery ignition system.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
The Jacobs is a little unlike most of the other radials in that it has on the left side a magneto like we would find on everything else. On the right side, it has a distributor, which is something that you would find on your Packard. Old Packard, yes, and so that's a little bit different. It doesn't produce quite as hot a spark, but on the other hand, it has the advantage of having a mechanical advance inside the distributor, so that it retards the ignition for starting, and you don't get the kickback like you do on engines that have the dual magnetos.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, and I understand parts were a problem for that too.
They have been in the past. That is being remedied to a large degree now by several different people that are manufacturing parts now for the battery ignition.
Yeah, the rotor, the coil, and those were hard to come by.
Yeah.
Now, as far as problem areas that a prospective owner should look for, what should he check on the engine?
I would say that probably the most important thing would be to go back through the logbooks and inspect it for who did the overhaul, how long ago was the overhaul done. You could certainly go over the engine for oil leaks, check it for compression. And oil analysis is oftentimes not that helpful because until you've established a baseline for oil analysis, you don't really know what you're looking at.
That's right.
But you could certainly check the screens for metal. Do a good pre-buy inspection on the engine.
One of the weak points on the Jacobs is the aluminum link rod, which bends rather easily. You want to talk about that?
It does? Sure. I have an example here of a Jacobs link rod. This is their aluminum link rod. And the problem is really a problem of design in all radial engines, in that they do have upper cylinders and lower cylinders, and because of this, the oil tends to drain by gravity to the lower cylinders. And so oftentimes you can find that after the engine has sat for a period of time, oil will have collected in either cylinder number 4 or cylinder number 5. It's very important that this engine be pull the propeller through to clear the oil that's in 4 or 5. If this is not done, what happens is the link rod moves down with the piston, it hits that oil, and then the oil does not compress, so the link rod bends. And this is an example of a link rod which is bent. You can see the the shiny area here in the link rod, it had bent over, and with each stroke was actually contacting the side of the cylinder skirt. This was something that was on its way to a catastrophic failure, but the customer did not even know that he had a problem. It continued to run just fine.
That's one of the caveats here. You know, it's awfully hard to tell from looking or running the engine that it has this problem.
Yes, yes.
I had a liquid lock about 12 years ago, and I found out primarily, although the engine ran great, the oil consumption went up tremendously in that one cylinder. But you may not have that.
That's true.
And so this is something that, particularly with a high-time engine or one that you don't know the background, that maybe would it be advisable to pull the bottom jugs if you suspect it and check for a bent rod?
If you suspect it at all, I would say yes. Pull, and you wouldn't need to pull them both. You could pull one and inspect both from that one hole. But yes, I would say if either if you have suspicion with an airplane that you're thinking about purchasing, or if you think that possibly you've inadvertently liquid locked it, I would say that just to be safe, it would be worth the few hours that it would take to pull that cylinder and inspect it.
And you know, Carl Baker told me about 12 years ago. Carl Baker, of course, was a very well-known engine rebuilder in the 60s. He said, if you bump it, you're going to bend it.
Yes.
He said, it doesn't make any difference. If you bumped it, you bend it.
Yes.
All right, we probably ought to mention the turbo.
Yes.
I'm sure you're going to get a lot of questions on the turbo.
Well, probably so. There are still a few of the turbo engines out there.
Yeah.
The turbo was a conversion that that Page did while they owned the type certificate back in the 60s. And their thought with that was twofold. One, that it would make an excellent high-altitude aircraft, and two, there was quite a market for the Jacobs engine on crop dusters. And so that engine was built with both of those markets in mind. It's not a bad engine, but it's an engine that it is very easy to tear up. And so people either love them or hate them. There are people that have operated turbos for years successfully. There are also people that destroy them in a very short time. You can overboost the engine, and so it's one of those things that many people are afraid of, and probably rightly so.
Yeah, I think the key is don't overboost it.
Yes, it is.
I would look very carefully at a turbo if I was thinking of buying it. I'd inspect it very carefully and think about that. Okay, what else should we talk about?
Well, another thing that we should probably mention in conjunction with the link rod, the reason that we have so much oil gathering in the lower cylinders is that the capacity of the sump on the Jacobs engine is not very great, and that oil drains down, fills the sump, and then overflows into the cylinders. There is a modification that has been done called the clean kit, which actually is 2 additional sumps, one at the level of the existing sump and one at the level of the rocker covers, which allows a place for the extra oil to drain. And not only does it lessen the danger of having a liquid lock significantly, it also lessens the wet starts when you start it and blow oil all over the airplane.
You think you're going to have a clean start, and you've always got an audience when you blow oil.
Yes, that's right.
All right. Well, Ray Woodmansey out in California at Ray's Aircraft Service came out with that mod.
Yes, he did.
And I agree with you. I think it's probably a desirable mod to put on the engine.
Yes.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Steve, for taking your time out of your busy schedule to talk to us about this engine. Now, this engine, obviously, is a cutaway. Beautiful. What is it, 245 or 275?
275.
275. Well, at any rate, I want to thank you again for talking to us. I understand you do about 1 engine a week.
That's true.
That's great. Let's keep these old birds flying.
Sounds great to me.
The Shaky Jake, Polish rock crusher. Got that name because the designer was a gentleman of Polish extraction. It's a great engine. Tough as a boot. Easy to work on by somebody who knows what he's doing. Runs great on autogas too, but be sure and get the STC. And also, before you start it, don't ever forget to pull the prop through to get the oil out of those 2 bottom cylinders. Okay, about now, I think we ought to talk about the paperwork issues, particularly the paperwork issues that you should be aware of before you buy any airplane. As they say, the job isn't done till the paperwork's done. It would be a shame to get your dream machine home and find out that because you forgot some little item of paperwork that you had a nightmare instead. I've got a very good friend down in El Paso, Texas, Len Goffner. He's been in business now as an aircraft salesman broker for many, many years. I trust him. Let's fly down there and get his words of wisdom. Leonard, it's good to see you.
Good to see you. Welcome back to El Paso.
Well, I came down to see you.
Great.
Let's go to your office.
Let's do it. Got a car right over here.
Good. Well, Leonard, this is certainly a lot better than standing out there on the ramp, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
It is, with all that airplane noise. You know, you've got to have airplane noise around an airport. But look, what I came down here to talk to you about is how can I protect myself when I buy an airplane?
Larry, I'd suggest that you start with the National Transportation Safety Board. Very often, incidents or accidents involving any airplane that you have an interest in may not be available through the FAA, but the National Transportation Safety Board may in fact have a report of it. And the two don't go together. The NTSB and the FAA do not intermingle their records. So when you contact your title company to do the title work, ask them specifically to do a check with the National Transportation Safety Board. It takes 2, 3, maybe 4 days, but have the patience before you run off to buy that airplane to get that information back. May save you some airfare. You may not even want to go look at the airplane if you find it's been destroyed and rebuilt. Now, assuming that you got an airplane that has no incident or accident, then of course the next step is to ask your title company to do several things. The first one I would suggest would be a list of owners. This will tell you several things. First of all, has the airplane been exported and re-imported to the United States? Has the airplane been based in an area with high humidity and high temperatures? Corrosion is certainly a factor with the Cessna 195, and you would want to factor this into the purchase price. So it spent most of its life in that environment. The next thing you might want to do is call some of the more recent owners of that airplane and talk to them. And with that list of owners in hand, that's easy enough to do. Once you have satisfied yourself that the ownership of the airplane tracks, then the next thing you want to ask for from the title company is are all of the Form 337s. Now, Form 337 should be on file with the FAA for any repair or alteration of an aircraft. Not necessarily going to be, but they should be. So get all of them you can from the FAA, and this, along with the list of owners where the airplane's been based, the NTSB records tend to give you kind of a mental picture of what that airplane should be like when you go off to look at it and maybe inspect it further and fly the airplane. Before you do, of course, you need to know who legally owns the airplane. The title search is going to provide the registered owner, of course. That's the man you're probably talking to, but it'll also show if there are any liens still on the airplane from previous owners or maybe even the current owner. Now, the problem comes from back in the 80s and even into the 90s, where we had the Resolution Trust Authority that took over a lot of banks. Those banks have disappeared, and in recent years a lot of banks have been bought up or they've been involved in mergers, and many of them banks have disappeared. So if a bank back 20 years ago had filed a lien on the airplane, we hope that they release a lien, but very often banks are quick to put that lien into effect with the FAA, but they're not nearly as quick to release it. So very often on a title search you're going to find liens going back 10, 20, 30 years or more, maybe even a mechanic's lien. Now, do not be misled by the owner that has a document that may be stamped paid in full by a bank. That will not satisfy the FAA's requirement to release a lien. So stop if there are any liens. If you want to, and you can locate the bank if they're still available, or the shop that put the mechanic's lien on the airplane, you get on the phone and you could probably arrange for a release of lien. I've given you a copy of that form. Probably you're not going to be able to find the bank, or at least that's usually the experience now. And what I would suggest you do is pay the title company to do that work for you. They do it every day. It's an ongoing problem with aircraft ownership, and they know how to get a hold of these banks or the successor bank. But more importantly, they also know how to prepare the paperwork in a format that the FAA will recognize and will use to release a lien on the aircraft. So once this has been taken care of, now you're ready to go ahead and look at the airplane, inspect it, fly it, and maybe buy it. So how do you handle the money? And again, I would suggest that you use your title company. Could be AOPA, could be Aerospace Reports, King Aircraft Title. They're all bonded companies, and you can ask them to handle the paperwork. But in addition to it, if you're not comfortable handling a $100,000 transaction, use an escrow service. Our escrow service is provided by the title company. What happens is you send the money to the title company, they hold it in escrow. The owner of the airplane sends a signed bill of sale to the title company. You now go look at the airplane, decide whether you want to buy the airplane or not. If everything is the way it's supposed to be, all you have to do is pick up the telephone, call the title company, release the money to the owner, and by wire transfer he can have it in 1 or 2 hours, and you get in your airplane, have a good flight home.
Oh, wouldn't that be a tragedy? Put down your hard-earned money, fly your pride and joy home, and find out that you really didn't own it, that some bank in far-off Timbuktu had a lien on that airplane. Remember, it's not like a car. Just because you have a registration certificate and a bill of sale doesn't mean you have clear title to that airplane. Heed Leonard's advice. Get a good title search. Use an escrow company. Well, we've talked long enough, haven't we? Let's go fly this thing. Folks, pre-flight on the Cessna 195 is pretty straightforward, just like any other general aviation airplane, with a couple of exceptions. A good pre-flight checklist is included in your pilot's operating handbook, the Cessna handbook. The exceptions I want to point out: number one, you must always pull the prop through before starting to clear the oil out of these bottom cylinders that Steve Curry talked about. Now, check the mags before you do it. I've done that. But assume the worst. You might have a hot mag, so always treat this thing as a loaded gun. All right, we start out pulling the blades. 1, count the cylinders. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All the cylinders are there. They've all got good compression. That's another thing you're checking. I like to add a few more blades, maybe 4 or 5, just for good measure. All right, having done that, we're ready to start the rest of the pre-flight. Moving around from the prop, of course, we check the oil. 195 holds 5 gallons. That's back from the old days when it had steel cylinders. Most modern Jacobs engines, of course, don't really need that much, but I would definitely carry it at least 3.5. Normally, I carry mine at 4.5 when I'm on the road. All right, brakes. Be sure and check the wheels and the brakes. Take a good look down here. Tire condition, because remember I said brakes are a no-go item on this airplane. If you lose your brakes, you're going to lose the airplane. Walking around, checking the leading edge. As we get to the ailerons, remember John Hamilton and I think John Collette both mentioned problem with the aileron brackets. Take a good look at these. The earlier airplanes have an AD on the aileron brackets. If they are cracked, it's very hard to see, but nevertheless, take a good look up in there at the aileron brackets. Same thing back here with the elevator hinge brackets. take a good look at those hinge brackets. There's a 12-pound weight right here that exerts an awful lot of pressure on those hinge brackets. Another thing that's very important to check on the 195 is the trim tab security. There should be no excessive play in this trim tab. If you've got a lot of play in this trim tab, check it out, find out where it is, in the actuating rod or in the piano hinge, but find it out. You can't see the rudder cables, but of course you can take a look down through here and judge the height of your tail strut. With experience, you can tell whether the tail strut's inflated. Checking the aileron hinge, the elevator hinge. As you come around here, take a look at your gas caps. You can tell whether they're secure. All right, as we come around, we wind up here. Check the left wheel. Left wheel for any signs of damage. Look around here for any signs of wrinkles. One thing I like to do, as long as the engine's cold, don't try it when it's hot, I like to grab the exhaust stack and give it a wiggle. A friend of mine in a Turbo 195 last week had his exhaust bayonet stack fall off the airplane in flight. All right, that completes the pre-flight. I think it's about time to go fly.
Starting this thing is very conventional for most airplanes. The round engine, the radial engine, has a couple of different things I'll point out as we go along. Always use your checklist, of course. All right, throttle cranked. Mixture rich. Carburetor heat cold. Mags to off. Fuel on. Always start the 195 with the prop in the full out, full high pitch, low RPM position. That's to prevent oil from going to the propeller hub first rather than the engine. Pull the primer. It's going to take at least 4 shots. Do not ever pump the throttle on a radial engine to get it started. That'll almost guarantee an engine fire. Okay, we prime it 4 times. There's once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and I like to leave the primer out so we can keep it running with the primer if it in cold weather on a cold start or any time it doesn't seem to want to run. Do not pump the throttle. Okay, we clear the area. Clear. Push the starter button. Let the prop go through about 4 or 5 blades, and then we'll switch to B start. Once the engine starts, bring that primer all the way in. Check for oil pressure. Let it idle for about 30 seconds before you bring the prop forward. We've got good oil pressure, stabilized. Now we'll bring that prop in. Hear the RPM speed up. Let's slow it down and idle here for a couple of minutes at about 800 RPM. Okay, we've been sitting here idling long enough. Let's taxi. Clear the area. Bring the power up smoothly and start to move. All right, now, taxiing with this thing, you're pretty blind over the front. So S-turn as necessary to keep it clear in front. Keep it clear in front. Some of us have a little convex mirror up on the right side, which helps a lot. Fregosi Unicom Cessna 195 Lima Bravo is on the ramp. Request airport advisory for local VFR. All right, we're in the run-up position now. Run up in this airplane. Bring the prop up to, rather the tack to 1500 RPM. For your mag check, right, back to bow, left, back to bow. While you're at 1500 RPM, cycle the prop. Another difference with the 195 and the ham standard, you look for a 500 RPM drop. First flight of the day, I cycle 2 or 3 times. Second flight of the day, maybe once. All right. Mixture rich. Carb heat in. Oil pressure. Check your gauges. Control check. Back to an 800 RPM idle. And I guess we're ready to go. Last minute carb heat check, and if you have a carburetor air temperature gauge, it's a good idea to carry a little bit of carburetor heat on takeoff. This thing's a real ice maker. Trim set, rudder trim, aileron trim, and elevator trim. Here we go. Time to go back in and do a couple of touch and goes and let you see how this thing lands. Fregosi Intercom, Cessna 195, Lima Bravo is 5 miles to the southwest. We'll be entering left downwind 19, touch and goes at Fregosi Springs. Okay, we're set up on final, full flaps. Power as necessary. According to the lights, we're on the glide path, aren't we? Gradually slowing it down, trimming back. And on short final, I test the brakes on the 195. Brakes are a no-go item on this airplane. And if you don't have a brake on final, that'd be a good time to find out about it. Remember, the key to landing this airplane and keeping control of it on the runway is don't get complacent. Never take your eyes off the runway for a minute.
Okay, 4830 Mike, we're right off your left wing now, sir. Okay, appreciate it. I don't have you, but I'll stop and turn. Have a good port. 2. Back on.
Okay, we've taxied up in front of the hangar now and shut down procedure. 1500 RPM, prop full out. Look for the 500 RPM drop and leave it out there. All right, let's back off now and close the throttle. Below 500 RPM, let it idle for a couple of minutes to scavenge. While we're doing that, we can do a mag check, or rather a grounding check. Make sure we don't have a hot mag. And we'll wait a minute or two, and when we feel it scavenged sufficiently, mixture full lean, mags off, master off, fuel off.
So you want a 195. Well, I hope this brief introduction has whetted your appetite even more. We've tried to give you a taste of this great airplane that has been such a big part of our lives for the past 37 years.
That's right. It's brought us adventure, friends, experiences, taken us places we never would have gone if we hadn't taken the plunge so many years ago. It's truly been a magic carpet, and it's never let us down.
One author has said the airplane was endowed with massive beauty and the protective feel of a plush limousine. Certainly in the late 40s, there was nothing else like it. The Cessna business liner has earned a great reputation, and now, 46 years after the last one rolled off the line, it's more popular than ever.